Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me tonight for this performance. I am coming to you live from the Catherine Alvord Gerlich Theater here at Meany Hall on the campus of the University of Washington. Just want to let you know that all the program details, including all the movements, are written in the comment section below your stream on YouTube if you'd like to reference that throughout the performance. All of the composers featured on tonight's program are living composers. And one of the most wonderful things about playing music by living composers is the opportunities that are afforded to make connections with them on multiple levels. And I often get asked how I devise a program. And tonight's program came to be specifically because of the various connections that I have and have recently formed with some of the composers on tonight's program. It ranges everything from playing pieces that I've played for 15 years or more that just through this pandemic felt very cathartic in that I had so many great memories associated with those pieces or with particular composers. And then some of the works came to find themselves on this program because they were just pieces that somehow, despite having all other kinds of music on my piano, I just kept being drawn to these same pieces over and over again. So the first piece I'm going to play for you is by Wayne Horvitz. Many of you here in Seattle and all around, I'm sure, know who Wayne is. He's a great jazz pianist and composer, and I have been the lucky recipient of many of his piano pieces. Tonight's piece that I'm playing for piano alone in 4 parts is the first piece that Wayne wrote me. It was premiered on November 4th, 2009 in Benaroya Hall as part of the Earshot Jazz Festival. And interestingly enough, I'm not sure that even Wayne knows this, that date happened to be the 1-year anniversary of my father passing away, who was definitely my #1 fan. So there's just something that always feels very special about playing this piece. So this is Wayne Horvitz's For Piano Alone. The next piece I'll be playing was written for me by my dear friend and colleague here at the University of Washington, Melia Watras. Melia is not only an outstanding violist, but also a wonderful composer as well. And I feel very fortunate that she wrote this piece for me back in 2019. I was supposed to have given a premiere in front of an audience in 2020 for the New Music Gathering in Portland, and of course that became a remote affair due to the pandemic. So once again, I'm playing the piece without anyone physically here in the room, but hopefully sometime in the near future that will all change. The title, Otra vez, means again, and I should be careful about what stories I tell Melia, because this is the second time that she writes a piece now based on an anecdote having to do with my daughter. Back when she was, I believe, only 4 years old, my daughter Vina, she was the first time she was going to full-time preschool, and she wasn't used to going to school every day. So first day, wake her up, and she's fine and excited to go to school, and then the next day I wake her up and she was just dismayed and said to me, "Otra vez?" Because apparently she just couldn't believe that she had to go to school 2 days in a row. So I told the story to Melia, and somehow that story stuck with her, and she ended up writing this piece for me. It's an introduction and rondo, and the marking for the rondo has to be one of the quirkiest and most fun comments, musical markings I've seen. It says "come le vespe," which means like wasps. So you'll hear stuff that may sound like I'm swatting those wasps, although I don't know if it's meant that I'm the wasp driving my daughter crazy by waking her up every day for bed and for school, and you hear this little buzzing theme that keeps coming back. If you would like to ask Melia more questions about this piece, please stay tuned after the concert. Melia, Wayne Horvitz, and Carlos Sanchez-Gutierrez will all be joining me and Mark Rodgers from the Music History Department for a post-concert Zoom Q&A. So this is Otra vez by Melia Watras. The composer of the next piece I'm going to play, Katoka Suzuki, is somebody that I actually met here in Seattle at Jack Straw. She just happened to be in town presenting several of her works. A friend of mine who's a violinist was playing a piece of hers, and I just loved the music that I heard. She was living in Berlin at the time, and it turned out that we had many friends in common, and that's how our relationship forged. I've played another solo piece of hers, and then she sent me this one, Shimmer Tree, which I believe I played the second movement several years ago that is for piano and electronics, and now I'm playing the first movement. And this is a piece, we recorded it, I believe it was last year before the pandemic, or maybe a year and a half ago now, in Arizona, and so it will hopefully be coming out soon on a recording. And the piece is in memoriam of Jonathan Harvey, and I just wanted to read her program note for this. She writes that this work was written in memory of the British composer Jonathan Harvey. He was a deeply spiritual man and beautifully sensitive to the details that surrounded him. I vividly recall a particular moment as we sat together by a window one sunny afternoon in California discussing music. In the middle of his sentence, he paused and looked outside the window, mesmerized by a tree as its leaves gently swayed in the wind. He then softly said, "Do you see how beautifully that tree is moving?" This piece depicts the image of this moving tree. next piece I'll play for you is by my very good friend, Carlos Sanchez-Gutierrez. This is probably the piece I've played the longest and the most often from all of the pieces tonight. I think it has morphed through the course of many years. It began when I first received the score as 3 movements, what are now the first, second, and fifth movements. And then the movement used to be number 4, Ariles de Campanario, was the movement that Carlos wrote for me. That's now in the middle. And another movement, Genghis, which is now the 3rd movement, comes from a different piece of Carlos's that I had played that was for piano, marimba, and orchestra, titled Ex Machina. I've played a lot of Carlos's music, and he is actually no stranger to Seattle audiences. Back in 2007, the first year that I did the Slam Festival, the Seattle Latin American Music Festival, Carlos was our composer in residence, and we featured music of his each night on the program. And then the last concert that I gave that had an audience was with the Seattle Symphony in February of 2020, when I premiered Short Stories 2, piece for piano, percussion, and string orchestra that Carlos had written. So that last live concert experience is just always there in my mind, wondering when we're going to get back to that. And it just kept Carlos in my head, and I was having so much fun had been having so much fun working on his piece last year. And I pulled out Mano a Mano when I was deciding what to play for this concert. And it just brought back so many good memories, not only of the places where I've played this piece, which was everywhere from Cuba to El Salvador to many cities in Mexico and Eastman and New York City and and Miami and just all over the place. So just makes me think of the good old days. So this is Mano a Mano. Thank you. So that last work you heard was Eva-Maria Houben's piece. And I just found out from her this morning that that performance is the US premiere. It had never been played here before. This was Meditations number 8, and then you see carillon is in parentheses, and this is part of a series that she has really expanded in the last year. I think she's now up to 20. And it was a student of mine, Tristan, who is the one who brought her music to my attention. He was playing her 14 meditations for piano, and I just thought they were gorgeous. And I started diving even more deeply into her music spring quarter when we suddenly found ourselves remote and working with the modern ensemble that I direct. Her music lent herself to how we were rehearsing over the internet, and it allowed for a lot of freedom and a lot of exploration to do with the students, and it was just really quite an experience to immerse ourselves in her work. So she instantly came to mind when I was thinking about programming this concert. So the last piece you'll hear today is Mystika by Tanya León, a Cuban composer. And I first met Tanya easily 20 years ago, very quickly at a concert at the Society for Ethical Culture. I was playing another composer's piece, and she happened to be in the audience, and we were introduced, and kind of that was that. And I've had all her piano scores. She's always been there in my brain as someone that I needed to play and be in touch with. And then a couple of months ago, I was looking through a drawer in my office, and I came across some of my dad's photos and some other clippings, and one of them was a newspaper article from a concert. It was one of the Spanish language newspapers in New Jersey. It was the Social Pages, and they were talking about a recital by my former piano teacher, Zenaida Manfugas. And there was a picture of my dad and my mom standing there beside Zenaida. And as I read the article, one of the people that they mentioned having been in attendance was Tanya León, and this was back in 1986. So as soon as I saw that, I just thought, I have to get in touch with her now. And we had a great conversation the other day, and it turns out that she also studied with Zenaida Manfugas back in Cuba, and she remembers that house where that concert was, and there's so much overlap. It was pretty incredible. This piece, Mystika, she wrote as a Mother's Day gift for her mother. Ursula Oppens, who premiered the work, was down in Cuba playing a concert, and it just so happened to be on Mother's Day. So Tanya wrote this piece for Ursula to play there, and then she wrote something on the score for her to give to her mother, who would be in attendance at the concert. And then while the day that Tanya and I were on the phone, she mentioned that it just also happened to be the 7-year anniversary of when her mom passed away. So it just seemed like there were all of these coincidences lining up that led to me programming this. So here is Mystika by Tanya León. Thank you all for joining me tonight. Please stay tuned for a post-concert Q&A with Carlos, Melia, and Wayne coming up in just a minute. Thank you.
Es la maestra.
Here she is indeed. Congratulations, Cristina, and thank you so much for treating us to this stunning and virtuosic performance. As everyone is saying in the chat, brava and congratulations. So my name is Mark Rodgers, and I teach music history at the School of Music here at the University of Washington. And I'm thrilled that joining me now for this live discussion
Es la maestra.
Are three composers themselves, Wayne Horvitz, Carlos Sanchez-Gutierrez, and Melia Watras. So Cristina is joining us. Thank you, Cristina, for being here. But before we proceed to questions, I'd like to introduce the three composers who are joining us this evening. So Wayne Horvitz is a composer, pianist, and electronic musician who has performed extensively across the globe. He's the leader of the Gravitas Quartet, Sweeter Than the Day, Zoni Mash, the 4+1 Ensemble, and co-founder of the New York Composers Orchestra. But before we proceed to questions, sorry, we have an issue with YouTube in the background here, playing on top of us. So Wayne has also performed and collaborated with Bill Frisell, Butch Morris, John Zorn, George Lewis, Robin Holcomb, Fred Fifth, Julian Priester, Michael Shreve, and Carla Bley, among others. Commissions include the NEA, Meet the Composer, Kronos String Quartet, Seattle Chamber Players, BAM, and Earshot Jazz. Collaborators include Paul Taylor, Liz Lerman, Bill Irwin, and Gus Van Sant. He's been the recipient of numerous awards, including 2 MAP grants and the NEA American Masterpiece Award. He's the music programmer for the Royal Room here in Seattle and a professor of composition at the Cornish College of the Arts. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Carlos Sanchez-Gutierrez was born in Mexico City in 1964 and now lives in the New York tundra, where he's professor of composition at the Eastman School of Music. He studied with Jacob Druckmann, Martin Bresnik, Stephen Mackey, and Henri Dutilleux at Yale, Princeton, and Tanglewood, respectively. He has received many of the standard awards in the field, such as the Barlow Prize, the Guggenheim, Fulbright, Kusevitsky from American Academy of Arts and Letters. He likes machines with hiccups and spiders with missing legs. He looks at Paul Clay's notebooks every day and tries to use the same set of ears to listen to Bach, Radiohead, or Ligeti. Welcome, Carlos. Finally, violist composer Melia Watras has released 7 albums as a solo artist and can be heard on over a dozen chamber music albums. Her compositions have been performed in New York City, Chicago, Seattle, Bloomington, Denmark, and Spain by such artists as the Avalon String Quartet, violist Attar Arad, singer Galia Arad, pianists Winston Choi and Cristina Valdés, violinists Manuel Guillen, Yura Lee, Rachel Lee Priday, and Michael Jin-Soo Lim, cellist Sayun Thorsteinsdottir, and percussionist Bonnie Whiting. Watras's music has been heard on National Public Radio's Performance Today and can be found on the albums Firefly Songs, Schumann Resonances, and 26. She's a professor here at the University of Washington. Welcome, Melia. So there's no question that the past year has brought many challenges for all of us. And so we thank you, the 3 of you, as well as the audience, for being here tonight, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. It's important to try to find the silver linings of our present circumstances whenever possible, I think, and the opportunity to bring the 3 of you together like this for a discussion with Cristina as well is truly special. So I've prepared a couple of questions for the 3 of you, but I'd also like to invite everyone watching along on YouTube to submit your questions via the chat on YouTube. And there's been a lively discussion throughout the performance. So I look forward to reading your questions and conveying them to our 3 composers and to Cristina. I'll continue watching the chat throughout this conversation. I might also like to invite the 4 of you to ask questions of one another as well. So I'll start with a question really for the 3 composers, and Cristina, of course, you're welcome to weigh in on this as well. But this is a question for all 3 of you, and I'll maybe perhaps ask each of you to answer it in turn. But it seems to me that one of the things that's so very special about this particular program is its deeply, deeply personal nature, right? And Cristina's talked about this throughout the program, connections with the composers, right? The sense of catharsis performing these pieces throughout the pandemic, not least because of the ways in which some of them hark back to the period before the pandemic, right? But also because of the ways in which they speak to our situation very, very directly, I think. There's so much more to say here, right? The intimacy of the live stream that we're experiencing right now, it's a very intimate program, right? And I think it works really well in this format. So Cristina, thank you and well done. It's been very personal, I think, for me and for many of our audience members as well. I wonder if the 3 composers, Wayne, Carlos, and Melia, whether you'd be willing to talk about how the pieces that you've presented here, that Cristina's presented here, came together in the first place, and maybe a little bit more about what they mean to you, right? So Wayne, perhaps you'd be willing to weigh in here first.
Well, first place, I don't think the chat was that lively. It was mostly just talking about how great Cristina was. I just would like to make that point first. Yeah, this piece was pretty simple for me. I don't know, Cristina might have to help me here. I think we had certainly met, and I can't remember what the context was in which there was some exchange, but I just, Cristina was someone that I thought was, partly because I knew Kung, Cristina's husband, first through jazz and improvised music, that this sort of an openness to an improviser's language. And then there was just the fact, I remember reading the preface to the Ligeti Etudes about him speaking to the fact that he knew how to write for the piano, but he'd started too late in life to really ever be a virtuoso. And this is something I relate to on every possible level. So my goal was simply to write a piece that I wish I could play. Kind of as simple as that. And I just took language that I already had and put it in the hands of a, in a broad sense, I just, consider like a conservatory trained pianist, which I'm not at all. And I think a lot about the connections between things like those etudes and other 20th century music, and Cecil Taylor, who was a great influence for me, huge influence. It was through Cecil Taylor that I found Ligeti, not the other way around. And so that really informed the piece. And so it was not much more than that. And then I hope this doesn't sound wrong, but I was astounded when I finally heard it, how pleased I was with both of us. And yet again tonight. So that's really the long and the short of it.
Thanks, Wayne. Oh, Cristina, please.
I'm going to say if Wayne wants to talk a little bit about how he composed the piece, because a lot of it came from you improvising at the piano. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it came that much from me. I mean, I think everybody who uses the piano to compose, which obviously a lot of people do. I mean, there are composers who work away from the piano, lots of composers, but I am not one of those. And but it wasn't so much that I kind of improvised things and that got me started. There was some of that, but it was more that, like I always compose, I sit at the piano, work things out. But it also was particularly since I knew that you could play certain things that it gave me an opportunity to work with someone at your level, that there was just sort of certain intervallic constructs, rhythmic constructs that are actually in all four movements, particularly the intervallic ones, that I was able to work. So yes, some of it came out of my hands at the piano, but other things were more, generating ideas on paper and kind of moving back and forth. But I would say it was more a lifetime of my improviser's language than actually improvising at the piano to make the piece, if that makes sense.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Wayne and Cristina as well. Carlos, I having read a little bit about Mano a Mano, I know it's a pretty personal piece for you as well. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how this came together, I guess, over a decade or so, and what it means to you.
Yes. First of all, congratulations, Cristina. Salud. Wonderful, wonderful recital and wonderful. Yeah, that's bad luck, But anyway, it was a great pleasure to listen to your recital and to this wonderful music and to finally get to meet all of you. I wish I could remember well enough how I wrote each of the movements of this piece. The first movements that Cristina alluded to, that were the original movements of Mano a Mano, I wrote when a Mexican pianist asked me to come up with a piece that he never played. In the end, he never played the piece, but I wrote these three movements. They turned out to be very virtuosic, and they all have to do with Mexican music, which is something that I don't normally do. I guess I was feeling particularly nostalgic at the time, so I resorted to aspects of Mexican music, but I don't really do that in my music, not because it has nothing to do with whether I like Mexican music or not. It just doesn't happen. My personal folklore is not really that, I guess. So they are all based on something that one can trace back to Mexican music, Mexican folk music, and as far as I remember, they were written from left to right, a little bit like Wayne was describing. I sat at the piano and I knew that these were going to be played by a pianist who was way, way beyond my technique, my technical level. So I went much further than that. Actually, in some ways, I went too far, as Cristina will, she's nodding furiously. So as Cristina will attest, it actually kind of cost me a friendship. A friend who was supposed to play what was originally the second movement, Bajo Punteado. She and I, are no longer friends because of that piece. That's how badly that performance, that process of preparing for a performance went. Anyway, the piece is ridiculously virtuosic at times, and to a limit that I was consciously pushing. I was really trying to get to the limit of things in many ways, while preserving, this kind of festive quality of the music that had originated the piece. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's as far as I can go because I don't remember very much about it. I added movements afterwards, as Cristina said before the performance, that come from other pieces really, and that now have been kind of adopted by Mano a Mano. And the beautiful thing about this is that, as Cristina also said, all of these pieces, even though some were not composed for Cristina, are now really Cristina's. You know, this piece really belongs to Cristina, you know, and nobody else. I find that to be a beautiful thing, you know, that, you know, a piece that was conceived with something very specific in mind, another person, including, you know, other pianists, now belongs to a dear friend. So I think that's really the most beautiful part of the history of these pieces, of these movements.
That is really beautiful. Thanks so much for sharing. And the borrowing from other works is a nice connection perhaps to Melia's piece as well, since I think there's some borrowing here also. But Melia, you've already filled us in a little bit, or Cristina has filled us in a little bit, I should say, about the origin story of this work and how it's grown out of your friendship, and in a particular comment of Vina Vu's. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the composition and how the work came together.
Sure. So with that story and with everything that I did with the piece, it is deeply about Cristina and the amazing things I think about her. And at the same time, I hope that they're common themes for everyone so that all of us can relate to it. I kind of like doing that these days, thinking of something that's very personal, but that has meaning for all of us, since we all experience, I mean, not exactly the same things, but similar life things. So Vina being amazed at having to go to school a second day, I mean, I totally was on her side because I felt the same when I was a child. And I did layer in other works that from my folk style project, now called Firefly Songs, that I felt were connected with me and Cristina and Vina. And one of them is Lament, because Cristina has lost both her parents. I lost my father. And when she played it for me on Friday, it just was a little hard to listen to at first because I've also just lost my parents-in-law. So that kind of all was wrapped in there. But it's fun too. With Vina, I also wrote a song for Vina called Mozart Doesn't Live in Seattle. And there's that, I reference that in the piece. And
Can I tell that story? Just very
go for it.
She was about 4 years old, and we're in a cafe in Salzburg, and she's having hot chocolate, and I'm telling her how we're going to go and see the house where Mozart was born. And the look of utter dismay on her face was incredible. I think not only at the realization that Mozart wasn't alive, but that he didn't live in Seattle. She's like, Mozart doesn't live in Seattle. Like, for her world, everybody lived that she knew or knew of lived in Seattle. So this was quite a moment of realization, and I just laughed at that so hard. And only Melia would take that and do something amazing with that story.
Well, yeah, Mike had a big part to do with how that story is so funny too, because my husband Mike did the lyrics to the song for Vina, which she performed herself and like knocked it out of the park. So all that's layered in, and the form, I thought, being a string player, I thought of a rondo because, again, I have to go to school again. So being a string player, the form, I thought, the piece that immediately comes to mind is Introduction and Capriccio, so Saint-Saëns piece. So that's why I put the introduction with Lament and Mozart Doesn't Live in Seattle, and then the rondo with the Vespa, which, by the way, when I did write the piece, I did have a wasp infestation in my house, and it made me think of Janacek setting mosquitoes, and Bartók set mayflies, I think. So, yeah.
All the way back to the Renaissance with Josquin and the crickets, right? Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, so there are a couple of questions coming in the chat on YouTube, and I'd like to encourage folks to continue writing in. Tanya León is also, I want to mention, is also in the chat here as well on YouTube, listening to the conversation. So thank you for that wonderful finale. It was a fantastic piece that I didn't know, and I'm very happy to learn here tonight. So I'm actually very interested in a question that Kang has posed here in the chat, not least because of the various ways in which family connections are really tying together the program in so many different ways. And so Kang writes that having had the good fortune of having repeated listenings to Cristina practicing the music that the three of you have written, it gave him so much insight. And he adds, with Carlos and Wayne's pieces in particular, because he's heard them so many times over the years, not terribly surprising, this time was particularly profound in how new the piece was during the performance in many different ways, and continues with a question about how the three of you feel hearing your music played again over time on repeated hearings and then over many years. This is a question for Wayne.
Okay, I'll go. Well, part of it, I sort of embarrassing, but I've used the third movement of that piece for a lot of grant applications. Let's just get into the weeds of how we actually make a living. So, for example, I hadn't heard the first movement in quite a long time, and there's just parts of it I know much better than other parts of it, and also I think parts of it, because of the process of how I made the piece and why I made the piece, remind me more. I think probably the slow movements more remind me of music that I play myself, or music that I make for myself, or that I play with other people in a either improvised or partially improvised context, whereas the two movements 1 and 3, not so much. So yeah, I think it's like anything. It's so great to hear pieces over and over again, even if they're your own. I think it's a simple sign. Find out new things every time. I mean, I have to say it's one of the ways I judge music, whether I think music means something to me, is if I keep finding new things in them. So I guess it's flattering when that even happens in your own music.
Finding new things or rediscovering pieces you'd forgotten about. Yeah, and that first movement's wonderful. I really love the kind of suspenseful, very delicate ending. Great movement.
And of course, what I'm thinking about every time I play these pieces, and especially now because we're finally, I think, going to record Wayne's piece. So I'm sitting there and going like, oh, I have to talk to him about this spot. Oh, after all these years, I really need him to change this one little thing here before
let's straighten that out. That's not going to happen. I mean, if Carlos can get away with writing what he wrote for you, no excuses.
Well, that's undergone some modifications. Every time I try different stuff, and then there are some things where I think, well, that tempo may have been more successful, maybe not, maybe this, but it's always it's just fun to have. So often when you're playing new music, you don't have a lot of opportunities to play the same piece. It's quite often that you may only have, you play it once. As I've been digging through my scores at home throughout the pandemic, I have found so many pieces that I forgot I ever even played. And it's been great, not only because I obviously love these pieces, and so I find excuses to play them as often as I can. But that I've just, for whatever reason, opportunities have come up to play these works.
Yeah, and I found a kind of a commonality in the pieces that I'm not really feeling prepared to explain. But I thought as a program, as opposed to being a program of contrast, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, but they're very complementary, but I thought all of them, I don't know, I shouldn't even say this, but I had an experience years ago where I was on a grant panel, and one composer who will remain nameless was on the panel. Another composer was being judged, who will remain nameless. And the composer on the panel said to me, I was feeling sort of funny about this piece that we were listening to, but I couldn't describe it. And the person on the panel said, I questioned the pitch choices, which in some ways just sounded like a pretentious comment. At the same time, it's exactly how I felt, that there was sort of a self-conscious modernism that wasn't really, and I didn't feel, I mean, I'm just going to say this outright, I didn't feel a bit of that tonight. I felt everything had just like tremendous harmonic intensity. Integrity is the word I was looking for. It also had intensity, but real harmonic integrity within, this very contemporary language. And I find I'm looking for that all the time and often not finding it. So I was really kind of blown away. It was just beautiful all around. Good taste, Cristina.
Thanks, Wayne. Although I did think about, just playing the complete Sciarrino piano sonatas. That would have been a very different experience tonight. There was a question much earlier in the chat that I saw that's from Michael Latterman, a flute player in New York City who I shared a studio with when we were students at Stony Brook. And he was asking Carlos about works for flute. We know you, and he saw about it being for Asako. I think Asako may have been at Stony Brook at the same time. So you definitely have twittering machines, but then he's also asking about Mezzo Soprano. If you have,
if I have music for mezzo soprano, actually I do not. I have music for soprano, but I suppose it's low enough that it could be sung. Indeed, I guess what I have in mind is something I wrote for Tony Arnold, and these are. It's a set of a cappella vocal pieces. They're not exactly songs, and they're all based on not exactly poems, but sayings by a number of artists that I'm very close to. Paul Klee being one of them, Arthur Ganson, artists that are constantly featured in my music. So that's something I did, and it's really the closest thing to a work for voice. Really, I used to write songs a long time ago, and I haven't written songs. I have a couple of operas or operatic works, but yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, that I'm of course babbling through the response because I have no idea what to say, because I don't consider myself a vocal composer, really. But Cristina, I wonder if you're going to say something about the fact that when practicing some of this music, it makes you remember the composer's family, particularly the composer's mothers. I know that it makes you remember my mother, your dead mother,
who is also no longer with us.
No.
I mean, Carlos, we have too many fun memories that we will not, some of them we will not discuss in this forum, but we've just traveled so many places. And the concert in Zamora sticks out in my mind as being one of the most interesting concert experiences. It was incredibly disrupted by a nun on a cell phone in the balcony. It's just, I'd never had that experience.
Well, there was a whole row of nuns, that came late and walked through the entire theater all the way to the front row and sat, and there were like 12 of them, wearing their entire nun regalia. And then one of them left the group, and moved to a balcony and started talking on her cell phone.
And the piano tuner that couldn't get this G sharp in tune, and the audience is there. It's 15 minutes past the start time, and he's there with this machine that looked like it was
a giant oscilloscope.
Yeah. It looked like he was trying to communicate with aliens. But so we could go on and on. We have 15, 20 years worth of these kinds of stories.
I know.
What else? Is there anything else coming up here in the
Yeah, there are a couple of questions coming up in the chat that I'd love to pose to all four of you, actually. A few questions about process, because I think, Cristina, you premiered all three of the works by these composers, or at least some of the movements. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more. You've hinted already at some of that process, but if you could talk a little bit more about how much the piece changes after you receive it, right? How the kind of the collaborative process between you as performer and each of the composers.
wow, that's it is hard for me to not have my mental Rolodex going while I'm playing and keeping track of things. And so I have to, I'm constantly having this conversation with myself while I'm playing to tell my brain to quiet and just focus on the music, and that I can always go back and listen to the recording, but I'm always processing and thinking about, oh, well, yeah, oh, I really, I should talk to Carlos about that. I should talk to, I forget what it was in Otra Vez that I thought, oh, why didn't I talk about that with Melia the other day? And so I'm always in the process of revision with this. And I think it's something, it's not necessarily unique to these composers. It's something that I do all the time. Even during the start of the pandemic, I wasn't really practicing. I was just kind of playing through a lot of my standard repertoire that was just there and very comforting. And I would just play a lot of Bach's C minor partita, Chopin nocturnes. And even with that, it was just like, oh, if I were to keep working on this for a recital, this is, and I remember from the last time I played it, what I thought was successful or not. And I'm just kind of always in that process of revisiting. I think with Carlos's piece in particular, I have completely abandoned attempting to do his metronome markings. I'm just, after however many years of thinking that I could be superhuman, and play something close to what he has marked, I've realized it's not possible. But what's interesting is I don't know that, anything was any more accurate not trying to go at the crazy tempos. So that is something for me to think about for the next time, And Wayne's piece, I'm thinking really on a totally different level this time around, because we're preparing for a recording. And that is always the way that I think about something and prepare it, whether it's for a live performance or a recording, unfortunately is different. Although I wish it weren't, or maybe it's because I know that I feel so differently when the microphones are turned on. I actually hate the process of recording, and much prefer to just play live. But Melia's piece, we'll see. I've only had 2 performances, but already this one I thought was different, and it was also different because I had time to play it for her. I actually could play it for her, whereas when I did it the first time, we were really at the height of the pandemic. And it was just, suddenly things shifted and I had to have the piece ready weeks in advance because now it was going to be on video or streaming rather than in person. And that just didn't afford us the opportunity to work on it. So, things always change. Wayne's piece, I think, has gotten much more spacious. Again, I've kind of said, bye-bye to the tempo he put for that third movement. I'm just this works better. I like this. This is what I'm going to do. And he could, register his grievance before we recorded, should he feel otherwise. Yeah.
Wayne, I think you're muted, actually. Sorry.
I am muted, and now no more. I think my experience as a composer, particularly through composed works and for classical musicians, or however you want to put it, is a little bit unique in that I was so used to working with people in all the early composition I did, whether it was in small groups or then larger ensembles, and then was always with people who in many ways had more experience than I did, but not only that, who were collaborators because of a combination of improvisers, jazz musicians, etc. So the whole thing of people saying, what about this tempo, is completely that's not unusual for me at all. And for me to go, yeah, you're right. I mean, you're the performer. I mean, in some ways, I've always felt like the performer has a better sense of that. And so I'm actually, maybe once in a while I'm like, gee, I really wish that could be faster, but I don't think so. I mean, basically, my feeling is that, and that whole thing comes to the performer's comfort zone too. If the performer is in a comfort zone, the music's just going to speak better. And I think that's true. You find that across the board. And I mean, it's one of the things I feel about certain aspects of contemporary music when people are pushing, different kinds of extended techniques, is that if the musician is miserable, the music's never going to sound good. And that's a universal truth. And so I think that to get the feedback from you has just been like a blast, frankly. I mean, we might poke at each other once in a while, but it's great. It's great. And Cristina has this great way of being just like completely like just complaining, just blatantly, and then having a great sense of humor about it at the same time, which disarms me totally, and I can't hold it against her. So it ends up being actually almost charming. And so I find it just really, really, really fun to work with, and really musical to work with.
I'm going to let Wayne get away with that right now because we're in a public forum. There's an interesting question in the chat posted by Tori about she'd love to hear which instrument is everyone's most challenging to write for and why. Melia, maybe you can start with answering that.
Sure. Well, I just wrote a piece for viola, harp, and strings. And let me tell you, it was the first time I wrote for a harp. That is so kooky. So I'd have to say the harp right now. It took me about a month to even just figure out the layouts and stuff. But thankfully, Valerie Lutolini is amazing and open and yeah. But my gosh, what a cool instrument. So I say the harp. Harp for me right now.
The harp is hard. Guitar for me. Yeah. I have a brother who's a guitarist, and yet, it's an instrument that I don't feel comfortable with. I'm a bad Mexican.
I've never written for harp, and I find the idea daunting. Guitar, I really agree with that. And funny is that I write a lot of music that involves guitar players, but it's not written guitar music in that way. It's not notated. Bill Frisell, even seeing his scores, he has a book of his scores, and it's just like, even the way it's written out on one staff, but kind of the way the range is, I mean, it just doesn't, it's really counterintuitive to me. But I actually find, at least in terms of the challenge of time, that piano is incredibly hard to write for, even though I'm a pianist, because it's just, I always sort of joke that I can write 25 bars of a string quartet in the time that I can write 5 bars of piano, just because of the kind of the notational challenges. I mean, not that I don't understand it, but just that it's time consuming to figure out. And I feel like with piano, often you have different ways you can lay out the same thing that then, I go back and forth how to do it.
That's really interesting to me. Also because Carlos, I think in a program note you've written for Mano a Mano, you've talked about feeling a little intimidated by the piano, perhaps the writing for a particularly virtuosic player. That's an interesting connection between these two works, a kind of underlying anxiety about writing for the piano.
I think the only of the composers whose music we heard tonight, the only one who is not intimidated by the piano is Tanya, because she's a phenomenal pianist herself. So you know, she knows the instrument. So yeah.
Yes, it's so well written and it's so well laid out, and even with when it's one single line, but yet she knows what to write for what's going to be stems down or the lower clef for the left hand and the right hand, and this kind of thing. It's really great, and I'm happy. I'm always when I work with student composers, I'm always trying to give them suggestions of works to look at to help them, to help guide them with their notation. And I'm happy to be working on Tanya's music now because I feel like this is an example that I can give. I often will say for piano music, I look at Messiaen. The man just knew exactly where to put everything. It always makes sense. When it should have an 8 VA, when it shouldn't. You know, when is it okay to read out the 1,000 ledger lines or not? All that stuff. He just gets spot on, and that's very, very similar in Tanya's piece as well. It all just lays really well and makes sense, and was really fun to play.
Well, we're pushing 9:30 now, and I don't want to keep everyone too late here.
It's more like 12:30 for me.
12:30 for Carlos, indeed. And who knows, there could be folks logging in from places where I don't even know what time it is. But this has been a really, really fascinating and interesting conversation for me. I feel I've learned so much from all four of you, and it's just illuminated what was already a really luminous and beautiful concert, recital, Cristina. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to those of you who are still watching on YouTube for your comments and for your praise of the works and the performance. This has all been so wonderful for me. And I would like to give the four of you the opportunity to say anything else that you'd like to add before we clock out. And thank you all.
I want to thank you, Mark, for moderating, getting the ball rolling, and thank all the composers for making, giving me, I'm never at a loss for great music to play. And that's a really, really nice place to be. So.
Well, I think we all feel just the opposite, which is we're really lucky to have you to play it. I mean, it's really special to have you play this music.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone out there on the interwebs joining us tonight.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Okay, have a good night.
Thank you. Good to meet everybody.
Thank you, everyone.